All right, well, I'll get started. Good evening, everyone. I want to welcome our audience and our panelists who are dialing in or zooming in remotely for our first online remote ADI policy forum. My name is Lydia Khalil, and I'll be your moderator tonight. Many of you have joined us before in the pre-COVID era for our ADI policy forum taking place in Deakin downtown in Melbourne. And while we can't all meet in person, one of the few silver linings, I think, during these times of restrictions is that we get to take advantage of some of the technology that's available to us and help us draw in a wide audience for our discussion tonight. And already we have over 170 people joining us, so welcome all. So for our first online ADI policy forum, we're focusing on the Black Lives Matter movement. It's a movement which has now gone global and one that's drawn our collective attention to issues around inequality, identity, racism, and the ways that institutions, not just individuals, can perpetuate racism and inequality. So tonight kicks off what will be the first in a series of these policy forums and panels on the Black Lives Matter movement and the many concerns that it brings up within the Australian context. Many of you are aware that the Black Lives Matter movement originated in the United States, where initially the focus of the movement was about police killings of African Americans. It focused on police killings of Black people and systemic racism, particularly, but not exclusively, against descendants of enslaved people and their ongoing struggle for rights and justice and equality. Now, over time, the conversation around the Black Lives Matter movement has expanded in the US and around the world to include treatment of other people of color, issues around implicit bias, anti-racism efforts, the interrogation of race itself and how constructs of race are used to categorize and identify people, and that these racial categories have various political and economic meanings depending on the context and the history and can determine who has access to resources and power. So the Black Lives Matter conversations have also expanded to include all of these things and include discussion around what it means to be white and what it is to be white in white majority countries. So since this is one of our first of many discussions in this broad and multidimensional topic, I'm hoping to use this first forum to introduce the context out of which the Black Lives Matter movement grew in the United States and how the movement plays out in the Australian context, how it intersects with the long history of Indigenous activism that preceded the moment that we're in today. So we have an amazing panel with us tonight to help us unpack some of these issues, as many of these issues as we can, and what I'm sure will be a lot of audience questions to get through. So I want to make sure we make the most of our time of our hour-and-a-half discussion tonight. A few housekeeping issues first. The audience will be able to submit questions via the chat function, and we'll try to answer as many of these as we can given the time constraints. I'd also like everyone to know that this forum will be recorded and will be made available for later viewing on the ADI social media channels. Before we start, I want to begin with an acknowledgement of country by acknowledging and paying my respects to the traditional custodians of this land and pay my respects to their elders past, present, and emerging. We may be meeting virtually on different lands, but in my case, I'm meeting you on the lands of the Wurundjeri people. And I have to admit to you, as a person who was not raised in Australia, that sometimes the purpose of these acknowledgements of country eluded me in the beginning, but I've come to better understand it. And hopefully with the help of our panel tonight, we'll make more steps to understanding more about the complex legacies that impact us today in Australia. So let me start by introducing them. We have with us distinguished Professor Marcia Langton, and she probably needs no introduction as she's a very well-known and respected leader within Australia. Professor Langton is an anthropologist, a geographer, and since 2000 has held the Foundation Chair of Australian Indigenous Studies at the University of Melbourne. She's produced a large body of knowledge in the areas of political and legal anthropology, Indigenous agreements, and engagement with the minerals industry and Indigenous culture and art. We also have with us Bridget Brennan. She is a Europe correspondent for ABC News, where she's based in London, although now she's home with us here in Australia. She was previously the ABC's National Indigenous Affairs correspondent covering Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander affairs across Australia. Bridget has previously worked as a reporter in Sydney, Melbourne, Darwin, and Hong Kong, and she's filed for some of Australia's flagship news and current affairs programs, covering Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander affairs, politics, international affairs, and social issues. Next, we have with us Dr. Berhan Ahmed, who is the CEO of the African Australian Multicultural Employment and Youth Services, an adjunct professor at the University of Melbourne. And Dr. Ahmed was the Victorian Australian of the Year in 2009 and was the first African Australian Senate candidate for federal election in 2004 for Victoria. He was a chairperson of the African think tank and served as the advocate for human rights and refugee settlement in Australia for African refugees. He was also on the Refugee Committee from 1997 to 2005 and a board member of the Australian Multicultural Education Service. Last but not least, we have Odongwot Manuel. She's a South Sudanese youth advocate, also known as AD. She does community development and is a professional and researcher who holds a double degree in Bachelor's of Communications in Journalism and International Studies. She's done extensive community development work in the South Sudanese community and has a special interest in bolstering excellence through education. She was awarded the Churchill Fellowship in 2019 to explore ways in which the African diasporas have successfully integrated in other Western societies. Welcome to you all, and thank you so much for being here.
Thank you, Lydia.
Thank you.
So before we begin with questions, I wanted to offer a very brief bit of context around the Black Lives Matter movement. The Black Lives Matter movement actually began 7 years earlier than this moment we're in now, in 2013. And it was through the work of primarily 3 African-American activists, Alicia Garcia, Patrisse Cullors, and Opal Tometi, who started a hashtag in response to police killings of African-Americans, and who began to organize statewide protests and open Black Lives Matter organizational chapters throughout the US. But it wasn't until the video of the death of George Floyd this year that was released at the height of the pandemic that showed a Minneapolis police officer, one who already had numerous excessive force complaints against him, but was still on the force, kneel on the neck of George Floyd for 8 minutes and 46 seconds while he begged for his life. It wasn't until that moment that the recognition and support for the Black Lives Matter movement grew in the United States exponentially. It was there that the Black Lives Matter movement really coalesced and channeled decades, if not centuries really, of frustrations and desire for change around the devaluation of Black lives in America, around a culture and systems and policies that have held back progress of equality despite years of activism all over the world. So with that context in mind, I want to throw the first question to everyone in the panel. And the first question is this, what do you say to people who say the Black Lives Matter movement has nothing to do with Australia? It grew out of this particular US context, it's not applicable to us. What do you say to people who think that the Black Lives Matter movement plateaued, or was imported by America and has little relevance to Australia? And then what would you say to people who may be Anglo descendants of white settlers whose ancestors may have been brought here as part of a penal system against even their will, or recent migrants who have come from different countries like Greece or Italy or Vietnam, who have no direct familial connections to Australia's colonial history, who think that none of this has anything to do with them? Professor Langton, perhaps maybe I'll start with you to kick us off. What would you say to those people who think that the Black Lives Matter movement has no place in Australia or is not relevant to Australia?
Thank you. I acknowledge the traditional owners and pay my respects to elders past and present. So yes, that question has been put to me a number of times. So first of all, let me say, there's quite a nasty response to the Black Lives Matter slogan that demonstrates a complete failure to understand, first of all, the value of all life. And that is, they say to me, all lives matter. And we've seen that all around the world. Now, yes, that's right, all lives matter, but some lives matter more than others. And, you know, I just want to say this. Everybody in Australia, it doesn't matter who you are, what the colour of your skin is, what your cultural background is, what your religion is, if you are arrested and incarcerated, you and your families have a right to expect that you will come out of incarceration alive. You have a right to expect that you will not die in custody. And that applies to everybody, every Australian. The problem is that the numbers of Aboriginal people dying in custody is disproportionate to our numbers in the population. And the arrest and incarceration rates of Aboriginal people is highly disproportionate to our tiny proportion in the population. So those figures alone show that some lives matter more than others. And I want to point out, in answer to your question too, that David Dungay died in custody in New South Wales in almost exactly the same circumstances as George Floyd. And the video is online. And I have it here. I can screen share it if there's an opportunity, just to show people that exactly the same thing happens in Australia. And I can turn to the numbers, but I think the other important thing to say first is the deaths in custody were brought to our attention back in the 1980s with the death of a young man in Western Australia. And his death was followed by other deaths. And I was living in Alice Springs in the 80s, and this was in about 85 or 86. And I was having a morning coffee at the old Italian coffee bar on the main street, and the bus pulled up. It was the old bus station, and a lady from Western Australia, an Aboriginal woman, got off the bus. So I said hello to her, and she joined me, and I asked her what she was doing in Alice Springs. She said, "I want to meet Aboriginal people and tell them what happened to my son. He died in custody." And so I helped her organise a few meetings around town. She travelled around Australia on a bus to tell people about what had happened to her son and other young men in Western Australia who had died in custody. This started in Australia back in the 1980s. But of course, there were thousands of deaths of Aboriginal people in custody going right back to frontier times. You only have to look at the history of Rottnest Island in Western Australia. So when tourists go to Rottnest Island now, they have no idea that they're walking on the graves of hundreds of Aboriginal people who died in custody there. So the proposition that Black Lives Matter was imported from America shows an alarming ignorance of the history of race relations in this country, the history of Aboriginal deaths in this custody, Aboriginal deaths in custody in this country. I worked for the Royal Commission into Aboriginal Deaths in Custody, which was appointed in response to all those mothers who protested about their sons dying in custody. And I worked for them from 1989 to 91. The report was tabled. It was a 5-volume report with 100 reports on the deaths in custody that had occurred within its terms of reference, tabled in the Federal Parliament in 1991 with over 300 recommendations, very few of which have been implemented or even implemented properly to this day. Many of the hundreds of deaths that have occurred since could have been prevented.
So clearly this has resonance and relevance to Australia, and there's a long tail of history that preceded this moment, which you really eloquently put out for us. Bridget, I was wondering if I could come to you next. You are an ABC European correspondent and an Indigenous Australian, so you've had some in-depth experience of 2 separate contexts outside of the United States. I was wondering if you could talk us through it from your perspective, since you've seen it play out in different cultural contexts in Europe and in Australia, and what are some of the similarities and differences of the issues?
Thanks, Lydia. Well, I think we need to understand why that slogan resonated with people, and it did from the get-go. As you said, the movement started back in 2013, and actually some of the founders of Black Lives Matter came to Australia to accept the Sydney Peace Prize a few years ago, and I met with them and interviewed them and spoke to Patrice Cullors. And she was very interested in getting across that this was supposed to be an inclusive global movement from the get-go. I mean, obviously it was started when Trayvon Martin was killed several years ago, but they were very interested in the context of Australia and our lack of racial literacy, the levels of racism here. They visited a lot of Aboriginal communities. I think they might have also gone to New Zealand and South Africa. So they were very interested in looking at the experiences of other countries. They wanted this to be a global movement from the start. And so they were quite staggered when they were here at the levels of child removal in Aboriginal communities, at the gross levels of over-incarceration, as Marcy was speaking about before. And so we also spoke then to some young Aboriginal people who had been inspired by the movement, and we asked them, why is this American movement relevant to us here in Australia? And really, they said that's just at the heart of what they had been saying, that Aboriginal lives matter, that they felt that their lives didn't matter in this country, in their country, on their country. And that they were very inspired by the way that the movement had used social media, the way that it spoke to people of all generations, of different backgrounds and faiths. And so some of those young activists were very inspired from the get-go. And so I think people have misunderstood that it has just been George Floyd's death. Of course, that was a flashpoint, rightly so. But actually, many years ago, Aboriginal people had been inspired by this movement, and it speaks to the movements that have been happening here for decades. So if you look at, say, the Day of Mourning in 1938, essentially Aboriginal people have been saying our lives need to matter for a long time. But I do think it's a bit depressing that we have this misunderstanding of our own history and that so many people don't understand that we do have shared histories with Britain and with the United States. Of course, we've got very unique cultural and political landscapes, but that so many of those lived realities are exactly the same for young Black people.
Well, that's a fascinating bit of information. I hadn't realized that the Black Lives Matter's founders had actually come to Australia and engaged with the Indigenous communities here. So that's really interesting to know. AD, I might throw the question to you now. What would you say to people that believe that the Black Lives Matter movement doesn't have any relevance to Australia?
Well, as an African Australian myself, to deny the Black Lives Matter movement's relevance here in Australia is to deny my personal experiences, is to deny my brothers and sisters and all of my friends of color that have struggled at the hands of police, who face microaggressions every day, who have a hard time getting a job because of their skin color, who get abused, in public transport. So even people like Scott Morrison, I believe, said something along those lines. And so when our leaders who are meant to protect people like myself say these things, it becomes really, really dangerous, and it opens up a space for other people to practice whatever they feel because they know there's no consequences. This whole concept of importing as well doesn't sit very well with me, because why is it when it comes to racism, all of a sudden we're importing this idea? We've imported, if anything, the white supremacy ideals. We've imported, segregation and discrimination from other countries. It was never here, it came here. So this concept of importing the Black Lives Matter movement really takes away from the seriousness and from people here in Australia screaming that Black Lives Matter and that it's not taken seriously. Once anti-racism is a global phenomenon. It doesn't just happen in America, it doesn't just happen in Australia or in Italy or in any other place. So I say to those people, once anti-racism becomes a issue of just America and not Australia as well, then we can have that conversation. But it's completely disrespectful to say that the Black Lives Matter movement is not relevant because it just takes away from me as a human being.
Right. So it clearly has resonance beyond Indigenous issues as well to the African Australian community. Dr. Ahmed, I'll turn to you next on your perspective. You've been working within the Australian African community for a long time. You clearly have a very good grasp of the histories and the stories around this. Let's hear your perspective.
Thank you, Lydia. And I really like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land we are standing today. And this is part of that legacy that we need to look at. First, it's a denial to say Black Lives Matter doesn't fit into Australia. People have been treated badly. What's going on now is clearly a demonstration that people don't want to accept the reality. People have been crying for a long time, and has been a fact that they don't want to accept it. And this denial is not the first time. Look, I have been living with Aborigines in many ways, and I have seen it. As an African, there's so much resonate in that treatment, because I can see young people here. If we go back in 2007, when we have that young South Sudanese murdered in a Nobel Park and was blamed, it's an African gang, but then 2 days later was being killed by white supremacists and young people. So always denial has been a fact of the process. Now it's a question that this is a constitutional issue. This is a systemic problem that we need to look at. We're asking as if it is a charity. No, this is a serious problem that future generation, and I'm telling you, and I saw it in my 25 years experience, kids are bored to be lining for a prison, not lining for education. If you look at the prison population from a Black society, especially now lately with Africans, we are less than 0.5%, and we have got over 11-12% in the prison population. Kids are not building a future to go to school. At school, they're treated like second-class students. Teachers tells them that you're not qualified. You won't go to university. You don't think that far. Like they tell police even sometimes, quite recently, young kids have been referred to police from school. So what I see is the system is a denial. What is happening in America is in America, but here is happening worse than what's happening in America, because people have not given the power, have not given the chance to address this. And also there's no receptive ears to accept and stand for a while. This is in the 21st century. Kids are really born to go to, when I was working at CSR or Melbourne University, I see kids dreaming to pay before they're born. They get registered for top schools. Our kids are born to go to prison. That is wrong. That is by itself a question that a nation has to take and has to consider what we're building for the future. And kids have not been treated because they are bad. They've been treated bad because of their color of skin, not because of any unique behavior or not any behavioral problems, but because of their color of skin.
So on this issue of the color of skin, Bridget, I want to throw the next question to you because it's somewhat related, and that's around the depictions of Black and brown people in the news media. We pick up our perceptions from what we hear and what we see around us. And so I was wondering what you have experienced as, say, a particularly problematic depiction or reporting that you've seen around Black and brown people, or what have been a positive or nuanced and informative reporting on issues and stories of Black and brown Australians. And how do these media depictions and media reporting influence our perception of Black lives and the lived experience both of Indigenous peoples or African Australians? And how does that, perception impact some of these things that Dr. Ahmed has been mentioning to us previously?
I think it is changing. It's at a glacial pace. We don't have enough First Nations people working in the media, so that's a big problem from where I stand. And I don't think we have anywhere near enough African Australian reporters as well, and from many different backgrounds. So diversity in the media is a real problem in our newsrooms. It's a serious problem. We've just had a report from Media Diversity Australia just last week looking at this, and it is not moving very quickly. Like, we just don't have enough reporters of different backgrounds and cultures and faiths in our newsrooms. And of course, that means they're not there at senior editorial levels, and so they're not making the calls on what stories should lead bulletins or who should be included. I think 10 years ago when I started, one of the things I used to see all the time was a story about Aboriginal people where we might have file vision of blackfellas in a community, but all of the people speaking were non-Indigenous people about Aboriginal people. So that was really common about a decade ago, and it has slowly changed. We are seeing more a diversity and a spread more of Indigenous Australians speaking in mainstream media. But I mean, I do think it's an issue of prominence as well. We rarely see Aboriginal stories at the top of a bulletin. It's an issue of siloing stories. So this is a Black issue over here, but we don't see some of our eminent experts who are Aboriginal Australians and Torres Strait Islanders included in a wide variety of stories. So when you don't have Aboriginal people at the heart of stories, telling their stories, you really take away people's agency. And so I do think that leads to negative perceptions of people, homogenised perceptions of people. But as I say, I think it is changing, and I try and be not too pessimistic, because we have so many brilliant Indigenous reporters coming up, and I do think that is going to make a real change, because they're the ones in the newsroom saying, this needs to be top of the bulletin, this needs to be on the homepage or on the front page. And when we start to see more of that, that's when we can start to see social change, I think.
Yes, and at least we're starting to see a much bigger conversation now, a more urgent conversation around diversity in the newsrooms. I mean, certainly now than years before. So that is a positive move in the direction. Professor Langton, I might come back to you and ask you a question around pandemics and protests. So the impact of COVID on communities of color has varied between Australia and America, and the response to protests during the pandemic has also been very different in Australia and America. So in the US, the pandemic has disproportionately impacted African Americans and other minority communities, whereas in Australia, at least with remote Indigenous communities, they were thankfully spared because of the strict border controls and also the work of the Indigenous community-controlled health sector. But other Black communities, such as African Australian migrant communities, may have been disproportionately impacted because, you know, whether they were subject to the draconian lockdown in public housing, or whether because, you know, some of them are on frontline work that places them more at risk of catching the virus. And regarding the protests, you know, the US pandemic brought even more people to the streets, despite concerns of the spread of the virus during the protests. I mean, it was the largest protest movement in US history. It eclipsed even the civil rights movement. The civil rights movement was hundreds of thousands of people. These Black Lives Matter protests were millions of people. And medical associations in the US and public health officials in the US issued statements pointing out that racism is a public health issue and must be urgently addressed. By contrast, in Australia, the protest action against, you know, and the way that it was spoken about with the Black Lives Matter movement and the Stop First Nations Deaths in Custody protests, they were discouraged by authorities. Organizers were taken to court to prevent them from protesting. And the protesters had been framed, you know, selfish or out of touch or lawbreakers. But Professor Langton, you voiced that despite the pandemic, protest in some form must continue. Yeah. So what's your argument? Why is protest in whatever form still important, even during a state of emergency? And why do you think the response to protests during a pandemic has been so different across the two countries?
Okay, so first of all, in my Thea Astley lecture, I urged protests to continue, but that doesn't necessarily mean breaking the law or going out on the streets. There are many ways to protest. Just today, I had a phone call from, you know, the Asylum Seekers Resource Centre asking me to telephone Alan Tudge to, you know, tell him that he should be releasing the asylum seekers from detention because of the risk of COVID-19. So ringing ministers up is a very good way to protest. Sending them emails is a very good way to protest. My giving the Thea Astley lecture was a form of protest. And indeed, I laid out surreptitiously a number of strategies for everybody. to think about in my Thea Astley lecture. But of course, the racists who respond with their dehumanizing chatter about, you know, how all lives matter and, you know, we're selfish and we're putting everybody's lives at risk. That's so far from the truth. It's a joke. I went into detail about what happened to Mulrunji, who died in custody in 2004 on Palm Island. And Andrew Bowe, a very good lawyer, and other lawyers represented him, Alex Watton, who led the protests in Palm Island, which resulted in the riot police being, hundreds of riot police being flown into the Palm Island community. And then later, representing the entire community, resulted in a $225,000 payment in one instance to Alex Watton and his family for abuse by the police because he had protested. And then in the case of the way that the riot police treated the community, a $30 million payout by the Queensland government to the community. And I think that's a very effective way to protest. Much of what the police do is entirely illegal. But the problem is that they investigate themselves and they always let their mates off. That's why there have been no convictions. And, you know, we see that with the African community here in Melbourne. Some years ago, there was a human rights inquiry into the abuse of young African men by the police who across, you know, that part of Melbourne from Kensington out to the west were being subjected, African Australian youth were being subjected to appalling racism. And it turned out that the high-ranking police officer who was responsible for integrity and police investigations had a number of false social media accounts where he was, you know, online abusing Africans in the most disgusting racist terms. So all through the human rights inquiry, the very same police integrity commissioner was online being an abusive racist. So, you know, I think we've all given up hope that the police can investigate themselves with any result that resembles justice. What we now need to do is find very effective forms of protest. Human rights inquiries, I think the way that the Day family persisted with the coronial inquiry into their mother's death at the hands of police again here in Melbourne was very admirable. They were in the media every time they had an opportunity, explaining to the public why it was completely unnecessary for their mother to die in custody. There are many forms of protest, and I want everyone to use any legal means available to them to protest the way that police treat people of colour in this country, or for that matter, the vulnerable. We've seen videos online of the way they've treated a severely disabled person. We've seen videos online of the way they treated one of their own, a woman police officer who they kicked while she was on the ground and basically tortured overnight. And the police always let themselves off. So we need to get our messaging very, very clear. No more police investigating police. We want open, transparent inquiry. We want criminal charges where there have been criminal acts by police. And what I'm urging is that we look carefully at the Royal Commission into Aboriginal Deaths in Custody recommendations and make sure that we do everything we can to get every jurisdiction, every police force, every correctional services department to implement those recommendations. So in my Thea Astley lecture, I went into some detail about the need for medical or nursing staff at every watch house and remand centre, because they're the most dangerous places for people of colour. And I could go on and on about those recommendations. But do you notice during this pandemic and the gag on protesters, making it illegal for street protests, the Council of Australian Governments, the National Cabinet met and declined to raise the age of criminal responsibility for children from 10 years of age to 14 years of age. Oh, it's terrible if we protest the killing of our people, but they had the gall to say to the entire world, in breach of UN human rights standards set out under the Convention on the Rights of Children, that none of them would raise the age of criminal responsibility from 10 to 14, and the Western Australian government whining about how there might be a threat to community safety from 10-year-olds. Just last week, the ACT government was the first government, however, to raise the age of criminal responsibility from 10 to 14, so good on them. The only Australian government to do so, and there's so much more work to do.
And given what we know about what the science tells us about brain development, it seems shocking that the level of responsibility is so low as it is already, as it is at 10 or even 14.
And you know, the other thing is you really have to organise and get the data. So I've got a document here somewhere. Let me see if I can find it that I want to just show you. I had a look for the data on African Australian youth in Melbourne in detention. And do you know what? There's no data. Now, every one of these reports will tell you how many Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander children there are in detention, but they won't tell you.
I am in it, Marcella. I'm a committee and there's no data exactly given to us. And we keep asking that.
Yeah.
So it seems like a key aspect, not just, protest is not just in the street. It's in the collection of data. It's in the appealing of those in power. It's the agitation for accountability. All of these actions are critical for moving the project of equality forward. I might just switch gears a little bit and turn to you, Dr. Ahmed. And I want to talk about African Australian identity. I'm interested in hearing your perspective on how African migrants understand their identity in Australia and their conception of a Black identity in Australia. I've heard it said before that there's no Black people in Africa, meaning there's no Black identity per se. Well, that might be changing, but that there are various ethnic or national African identities. So I guess my question is twofold. Is that true? Do you think there's really no Black identity in Africa? Is the label of African Australian or Black Australian imposed on people who migrated from Africa in kind of this undifferentiated, homogeneous way when they migrate to a white majority country like Australia? And then two, what does the term Black mean for African Australians? Because the African Australian community is incredibly diverse. Something that, maybe a fact that doesn't get as much attention, but it's clearly the case. So does it even make sense to talk about an African Australian community when you're lumping all these ethnicities and cultural groups together?
Well, thank you, Lydia. Without that, Africa is a diverse continent with so many cultures, ethnicity, countries, and every African is proud of their identity. Blackness is not an identity. It's an imposed colonial identity. Particularly when we came to Australia, there is no other way to define us but to define us with one word, as our color. Now, we stand to defend because why we are in this sort of state of mess. When we come to the community, the dynamics of the community is absolutely different. The community is colored. And part of that agitation that has been going was to invite the white people and to see the diversity of Africans, be it in culture, be it in language. Africa has got over 1,000 languages spoken, different tribes, over 1,000 tribes in different form or shape. No one African being called a Black. African Black is only when Africans left the continent. In Africa, everyone is known based on their tribe, ethnicity, and country. And that's the way mankind evolved. And this is what Africa has been in and Africans has been known. It's unfortunate the the white Australia has put every person of that, particularly when we look at it from the media perspective, every time the media label us and the rest cops. In fact, the worst I see it mostly, once this is reported, it impacts on children. And some children go to home and ask, who am I? And people have been asked this as age as 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 years old, which they're not sure who they are. And that's been imposed in them to believe Blackness is an identity. Blackness is who these people are, nothing behind. But that comes with historical sort of process of colonization. Colonization has done, and done it especially in the 20th century. All the movies has portrayed black as evil, white as an angel. And that set a mind in everyone to think that any blackness has got to do something with it. Every black means something to that effect. Now, that is where Africans and the Aborigines are paying a price to break that perception, if you like to call it. Black is not identity. But unfortunately, institutions have that mind in treating person of a different color. And I have been saying this, especially when it comes to employment, especially when it comes to opportunity. Your name could get into the paper, but your face cannot get to that paper. You cannot open a door when your color is revealed. Now, nothing more than the skin color. So as he pointed out, in Australia, blackness became an identity, which most Africans don't accept it, except but they are lumped together under one identity, and they have got no choice but to defend their identity. And this is where we stand in one to say blackness should not be an insult.
So AD, I might turn to you with this, because I feel like there might be a different perspective on this issue, perhaps from a different generation. I don't want you to speak for your entire generational cohort, but there does seem to be more of an embracing of a Black identity, perhaps in a younger generation. I was reading a really interesting Guardian report that talked about the generational differences between the African migrant communities. And because this generation of African Australians is one generation removed, perhaps, or maybe even 2 generations removed from their country of origin, that conception is a bit different. I'd be interested in your perspective on that.
Yeah, following on from what Dr. Burhan said, that, you know, back home, back in Africa, they didn't have that concept of Blackness. So growing up here, Blackness, the concept of Blackness has been imposed on us, and therefore we've taken it. What else can you do? You can't just say, no, I refuse to accept this identity. But I think the difference between our parents and the younger generation is not that they don't recognize racism or that we might have it tougher. It's that their priorities shifted. My parents, and they're only one generation, so I was born overseas, so I'm not that far removed. But I have a living auntie right now in Brisbane who told me her story about walking from South Sudan all the way to Ethiopia, and from Ethiopia through back to South Sudan and to Kenya to settle in a refugee camp. Always displaced, always not belonging. So coming here, they've never felt like this was a home. This was just a resting place. And when you automatically feel like you don't belong, then you're okay to put up with the laws of the other person's land. Whereas us young people, we grew up here in Australia, feeling Australian, only to be rudely awakened by everyone else and everything else telling us that we don't belong as well. So it's not that racism differs, it's just that us young people trying to push our way forward are fed up. We are forced to be in the community more so than our parents. They have to just go to work, make their money, but they can comfortably stay within their own community, speaking their own language, not venturing out. Whereas us younger people, we are forced to be around different people, working in places like retail and restaurants, where you do encounter a lot of different ethnicities, a lot of different kinds of people. And I think the difference in racism from our parents is that they experience physical violence, very in-your-face kind of violence. The difference here in Australia, it's very indirect. And I've had the privilege of being born in Egypt and growing up here. So I've had a difference in lifestyle. And in Egypt, it's very blatantly racist. I know your Egyptian background, but I'm saying it in your
super
face.
Racist.
Yeah, in your face, always calling out, the equivalent to the N-word. I went to a school where it was all Black kids, and then up the road was all Egyptian kids, which are lighter skinned and whatnot, and always been hated. I knew my place. I knew they didn't like me. And you know what? I was okay with that because I knew where I stood. Here in Australia, though, it's a lot more confusing. It feels more like a death by 1,000 cuts. Every day it's a different kind of microaggression. It's someone who acts like your friend until they feel a little bit threatened, and then they turn on you. It's going to the shops and being followed. I walk out of the house feeling like an Australian, feeling like a girl. But then as soon as I step out, I'm afraid. I'm afraid at the looks that I get. I'm afraid that I have to act on my best behavior because I'm a representative of every other Black person. I'm afraid, if I get upset at an injustice, that will be thrown back in my face as an angry Black woman, and then it just continues on. So having to always police yourself as a young person, having to always face these microaggressions as a young person, really weighs a ton. And I'm only 26, but I'm tired. So I can only imagine people who are a little bit older than me or who have been having to live through this for so much longer and what they have to deal with. I think their trauma has just turned into numbness. And us young people, I guess we have a bit more energy right now to fight our fight. And hopefully something changes soon because I don't want to get tired, and I am getting tired. Yeah.
Well, you bring up an important point about your experiences in Egypt, which goes to show you that issues around colorism and racism certainly exist outside of the Western context. I'm Egyptian background myself. I've been having a lot of conversations around issues around color and how Egyptians perceive other Africans, how they identify themselves, and it's incredibly complicated. And so just because you're someone like me who happens to come from an African country doesn't mean you don't have your own baggage to deal with when it comes from this issue.
That's internalized racism, and where does that come from? I mean, division has been used as a method to keep us down. So by comparing colors, by comparing statuses, even here just last week, actually, I was talking to an Indigenous lady and I told her, I feel really bad talking about, Africans going through it here in Australia when Indigenous people have it so bad. And she's like, sister, this is how they keep us down. Your fight is my fight and my fight is your fight. We're all Black and we all go through the same thing. And it's the division, of us and where we're at and who should be where and who should be fighting, who has a right, that keeps us stagnant. So we need to remove that division altogether that keeps us separated, because once we come together, that's when we can really make an impact.
So we have a lot of questions coming in from the panel, a lot of great questions. Before I throw it to audience questions, I want to use up my privilege as moderator to ask one final question to the panel. And that's a question around the individual versus the institutional. And I have to tell you candidly that I'm concerned that the Black Lives Matter, the conversations around the Black Lives Matter movement are becoming, or have the risk of becoming, a personal improvement project for non-Black people. So that the focus becomes kind of on white guilt or fragility or unconscious bias, instead of the focus being more on mobilization to tackle institutional and systemic issues and the transfer of equitable sharing of power and capital. On one hand, you have people who say, I'm not personally racist, I believe in equality, it's the other racist white majority who are directly the problem. And then you have other people who are so focused on their individual attitudes and trying to tackle their, unconscious bias and doing things like diversity training. But both of these approaches focus very much on the individual rather than the institutional. And so, while, what we might end up doing is just spawning another arm of the self-help industry. But on the other hand, there is a valid argument to say that for institutions and cultures to change, people need to change. And individuals need to challenge their implicit biases in order to tackle the systemic in the institution. So I'm interested in your thoughts about this balance between institutional versus individual. Professor Langton, I might start with you.
Yeah, good question. I think what happened when the death of George Floyd was videoed and went viral is that white people everywhere were confronted with the racism of that particular police officer who started that terrible incident, but he was joined by the others, don't forget. They behaved badly as well. They are complicit as well, and that's very obvious from the video. But to watch a black man dying under the knee of a white police officer just snapped everybody out of the, you know, the white fragility, I'm not racist, you know, argument, because either they're like that police officer who killed George Floyd, or they're not. So which one are you? So that's what the video did. It presented a moral dilemma, a question to be answered to all white people. Okay, where do you stand on this? You can't go on with your blithering, you know, white guilt nonsense about how you're not racist, but, or, you know, I don't ever see any racism in Australia. Well, that's because you're white, you know, or I never see colour. Well, if you don't see colour.
I love that one.
Yeah, etc. Okay, so where do you stand? And then David Dungay's death, also videoed, very obvious how he died. He died as a result of 4 police officers basically asphyxiating him. So where do you stand on it? Are you going to keep saying that I'm not racist and the implication is no white Australian is racist, and yet there's this evidence that there are white Australians who are racist? So are you not racist, or are you anti-racist? Are you going to keep justifying the behaviour of your racist comrades by saying, I'm not racist? Which one? Are you racist, or are you anti-racist? That's the question to be answered.
Bridget, how about your perspective on this?
Yeah, I think like you, Lydia and Marcia, I'm a bit conflicted because it would be sad at this moment if all it was just a big buy-up of self-improvement, anti-blackness books for people to do a little bit of a project and put a tile up on Instagram and move on. I think one of the frustrating things is, as Marcia said, what next? What are you going to do next? Like, I've had so many people say to me, oh, you know, I've been really shaken by this movement. And you need to ask people, well, does it make you uncomfortable that you go into a workplace and there are no Aboriginal faces in the room? Why has that happened at your workplace? You know, what's happening at your school, at your children's school? What's happening at your hospital, you know, where perhaps you're treated a lot better than a black patient? And so we need that extra step. We need not just the books and the, you know, bit of reading of history. It's much more about action, because as AD said, people are tired. It is really tiring to do this kind of work in your own time, basically unpaid. The cultural load on people is massive and they burn out. And we see this in Aboriginal organisations and non-Indigenous organisations where people tap out and just say, I can't be the only one, the only angry person in this room. It would be nice if other people were angry on my behalf. Yeah. And so I guess I'm not so much talking about systemic racism in policing and incarceration, but in all sorts of organisations, you need people to be doing the work, to be raising their voice, because unfortunately in Australia, unless we have the white voice in the room as well, we don't see change. And so it would be really sad, I think, if this moment was lost to just a few Instagram posts, I guess.
AD, how about you?
Yeah, I totally agree with Marcia and Bridget there, that it's not enough to just read your books and then you've done your part. And can I say, even the concept of individualism, what a nice privilege. You know, I don't think I'm ever going to really experience that, because my color groups me automatically. So to even have that privilege of individualism, where you get to walk down the street and not be classified as anything other than who you look, what you look like, and who you are as a person, is a beautiful thing that a lot of colored people do not experience. I don't understand why the individual and the institutional has to be separate. They can both go hand in hand. And an institution wasn't built on its own. It was built by men who have these ideas. So yes, we do need to tackle the psychology by people learning about what they can do, about their fragility, about their privilege. But then we can simultaneously as well work on changing institutions by bringing more people of color, diversifying, not just diversity for diversity hire's sake, but actually diversifying the workplace, diversifying the media space, you know, diversifying education. It's just this notion of incrementalization. I can't say the word, but like one thing before another. And I think that's just another way to really keep the oppressed by saying, yep, it's just one thing at a time. Let's get through the individual process first, and then we can start tackling institutions. It doesn't work like that. Everything in this world we seem to be able to do at the same time, or a few things at the same time, except for when it comes to equality, justice, and racism. Then we have to stand in line and wait for all of these other rights to get through first before our agenda is picked up. So yeah, I genuinely think that it can be done both. Everyone should be doing their work to educate themselves, and I commend everyone who has picked up a book and gone out of their way to try and learn how to be better. But yeah, like Marcia said and Bridget said, what are you gonna do next? Are you gonna actually have those hard conversations with your family members? Are you gonna say something when you hear something out of line? Or are you gonna stay quiet? It's not enough to just not be a racist. You have to go out of your way and be anti-racist. That's what we're asking for now. And it's everyone's responsibility, because it's not enough for Black people and for people of color to keep trying to prove themselves and to, you know, what can I say, educate. It's really hard to believe that, you know, the white man who constructed this whole world order, who've taken people to Mars or to the moon, Mars soon, hopefully, can
Elon
not
Musk hasn't
fathom
gotten there yet, but soon. Yeah.
Can't fathom this concept of racism. It doesn't make sense to me at all. So read the books that I'm sure were written by white people to educate yourselves, and show up and speak out when you see something going wrong.
And last but not least, Behan, I'll turn to you before we start the audience questions.
Thank you. Thank you, Lydia. For me, what I see is importantly, education system, our curriculum has to reflect, because we are bringing our children to be the same as the adults who are still not accepting the difference. They're nice at heart, but not nice in the mind, because they're not balancing that issue. They think about Black means charity. No one is expecting charity. We all are expecting opportunity. We are treated as a second class, as if not equal. Even, you know, like educated Blacks are not treated as educated. Adults with so many things, they're treated like children. What I think is now, the problem is in our education system, first to start with, because we need to accept this is a problem, and this problem can only be done through education. Education system has to take this seriously, because kids coming out of school are the ones still thinking of the old generation. And this will continue forever. When it comes to institutions, unfortunately, I have tried fighting with a number of institutions on this issue. The best example I can put is Victoria Police. For the last 20 years, I tried with Victoria Police to get Africans to be recruited into Victoria Police. And I keep asking, If someone flies from UK today can join Victoria Police tomorrow. Someone born, educated in Australia of a black or migrant background had to join. This is not an intellectual rigor. This is a cultural rigor that helps the system. So institutions have got problem addressing this because the comfort zone that they live in, it's hard. And I say it always this way. When we talk about multiculturalism, it's mixing oil and water. Now we need to mix milk and water so that we can get all mixed. But when you put oil and water, always there is one floating and the other is separated. So currently our multiculturalism is a token, not like milk and water, but it is more like oil and water. We are still separated in two different lines, expecting to be treated always with the kindness of the other, as in charity, to help us, to support us. No, we are in equal partners of this journey, and our kids are educated. Unfortunately, this also needs to be clear. The kids born here can no more tolerate like the old generation, because they've been educated, they don't know anything but Australia. They don't know anything but the life they've been brought up. They don't belong to Africa, they belong to Australia. So no one is expecting of these kids to go anywhere but to stay in Australia. So the Black Lives Matters is a start of a journey. If this is not take the institutions, the system to address this, there will be more of this to come, because people cannot sit hiding and waiting for a change to come.
So your point about education actually is a perfect segue into an audience question. And this question says, as a white educator in primary schools, how can I respectfully raise awareness of these issues among staff and students? How can I respectfully introduce Black voices and experiences into my classroom? I might throw this question to AD and Professor Langton. AD, do you mind if I start with your response to this?
Sure. I think people are a lot more afraid to ask the question than once the question is asked. So it's not that scary. No Black person will lose it if you tell them, hey, tell me about your experiences. I really want to hear it. I think my biggest remark would be just to be respectful and to listen to understand, not to listen to respond. Because many of the times people say that they're here for you, they say that they want to listen, but you start talking and all it is defense, defense, and more defense. So I think my biggest method would just be listening. Listen, sit down with the kids, tell them this is all you can say whatever you want, express whatever you want in a safe space. That's pretty much why people close up, because they don't feel safe. They don't feel like they will actually be heard. They feel like this is just another way to trick kids into, saying something they shouldn't. So by providing a safe space, first of all, and that comes from you, I think people know automatically where a person comes from just by their demeanor. So don't be afraid to ask those questions towards kids. Teachers, that's a whole different ball game, because I know people who go into schools to teach about white fragility and cultural competence, and these are white teachers, and they get blacklisted from schools. They are shunned by other white teachers themselves. So I can only imagine how that works out. So I'm not sure about that one. Maybe Burhan has the answer.
Well, I put the question next to Professor Langton because I want to ask that and also a related question from the audience, which is relating to finding space for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders to share their diverse truths with non-Indigenous people is problematic. And what is the best approach to facilitate this? So forums for sharing truths in a non-problematic manner, and this issue around education.
as AD pointed out, it's an absolute career killer for a white teacher to try to teach Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander studies or Indigenous studies, or, you know, introduce their class to the African Australian community in Australia now. Absolute career killer. And teachers, by and large, that is the majority, have a range of excuses, and it's a bit like the, you know, I'm not racist. I've never seen any racism. That's because their whole world is white, and it's so normal for everything to be so white. They can't imagine a world where, you know, the African Australian community down the road actually have jobs, like Berhan pointed out, in the police force and other institutions. So it's that normative racism. They can't see racism because they live in the soup of their racism. They see it as normal to live in a white world. They don't see the rest of the world. So teachers have all of these excuses, and I've heard them all because I developed an Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander curricula with a group of about 30 experts, Indigenous and non-Indigenous, using the least disturbing material, you know, the least problematic material for white people, because they don't want to know about the history of Australia. They don't want to know about that. And, you know, every time you try to teach history, there'll be an objection. You're not allowed to talk about racism. There'll be an objection to teaching that, because you're a troublemaker if you do that. But so what I did was I round up all the experts on Indigenous knowledge, Indigenous and non-Indigenous, and it's all online. It's all free to teachers, and only a handful of teachers across the country have adopted it. I cannot get it into formal curricula in each jurisdiction. I'm recruiting a lot of powerful friends, you know, on a one-by-one basis to try to get it formalised as curricula. But, you know, we've been trying to do this for decades. And still to this day, despite the fact that the Australian curriculum framework tells us that there should be Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander and culture, it's not. So the other two platforms of the curriculum are, and the third one is not taught. It's not taught. And everybody pretends that it's optional. It's not optional. And so that's how it works, you see. So I'm trying to do this. All of our materials online for free. People can email me if they want to know about it. Can I get it into schools? Only with truly a handful of decent people around the country who understand why this is important.
Well, that context that you're sharing is starting to make something make sense to me, because I had gone to my children's school earlier this year and asked them about their curriculum around, you know, Indigenous issues and history and teaching about matters of race. And they said, well, we just take a colorblind attitude. We don't want to introduce these concepts. So this context that you're providing about all of these years of a reluctance to do so, because I was shocked, you know, as an outsider, as an American, this is something that's constantly taught to us in school about this history. And it doesn't seem to be the case in Australia. And so that's at least given me a better understanding of kind of the lineage of this problem. Bridget, I might direct the next question to you, and it's about Australia's media's reluctance to provide news on some of the matters that we're talking about now. So the question is, most people didn't even know about the 400 people, excuse me, who died in custody in Australia until the Black Lives Matter movement reached here. You know, most people, they receive their information from the media. So how can the public ensure that these issues are being covered and not omitted?
That probably ties in a little bit with education, in that we're not taught the history or even the recent history of Aboriginal Australia, and it is staggering to me, because when people were posting about that and seemed shocked by that, look, even though I know the low levels of literacy we have on these issues, I was shocked by that, because I thought, what? Like, we had a royal commission into that. How do you not know that? But then we had a national apology to the stolen generations as well. And a lot of people don't know that history either. So look, there's always going to be people who don't want to hear about it, so that's an issue. But I guess it ties in with what I was saying earlier, in that often we've seen Indigenous stories, you know, they're at the back of the newspaper or they're at the back of the bulletin. They're not given the prominence they deserve. And I do think that's changing. I hope it's changing more rapidly. But even when I was starting out as a journalist, I was told, oh, those stories don't rate very well. Like, they're just not very relevant to other people. You know, that was so offensive to me. And Aboriginal journalists in mainstream media organisations have had to work really hard to say, yes, they do rate really well. And I've since proved they rate really well. Why shouldn't these issues be important to people? But look, there are so many issues. There are issues around the fact that most of our state parliaments don't have any Indigenous people in them. That's a problem. Our federal parliament has changed a little bit, but we haven't had representation at organisational or political or media levels. And so those stories have fallen by the wayside, but we know these stories. So it is angering to me, but look, you know, as I said before, we can't always be pessimistic. People are learning about these stories. As Marcia said before, the Day family has done incredible work to get their story out, as have many other families in the last couple of years. It's just so sad that they've had to do that.
Berhan, I want to direct the next question to you because it relates to some of the points that you were making about African identity earlier. And the question says, is this idea of Blackness, could it also be a failing of the Black Lives Matter movement's attention toward Black lives only in Western contexts? So I guess the implication is that the Black Lives Matter movement may be disregarding people in the global South and focusing more on Western contexts like America, Europe, and Australia.
Well, look, let's not try to put, the world is not white and black issue. And this is not to demean that Black Lives Matters, because that is important as a milestone now, particularly in Australia. But the question I'm raising and the question I was addressing was that African identity is not on a color of skin. And this is truth. But when Africans moved out of Africa, the question of separation that colonial history has left, we are who we are. Now we are identified with our color of skin. We are not going to pretend we are not. And we have to fight for that because Blackness doesn't mean anything bad. And there is history to it, we need to fight it. And this is what Black Lives Matters is working on. But the point I need to make is that Africans in Africa and anywhere, we are identified with our ethnicity, with our tribal, with our everything. So that adds value to our strengths because we come from a very dynamic background, but we are united because of our color of skin. Our color of skin is our reality in the world that we are living now. So the Black Lives Matter is about our color of skin and about unfairness, treatment of blacks in general. Now, the question, going back one step with what Marcia has said and Bridget, I like to see leadership is critical. Black leadership is not existing in this sphere of giving power for our generation to hope, giving chance for our kids. We are asking opportunities that need to be equally divided to everyone. Aborigines should be one of the first people to be in the parliament. And they should be, but unfortunately, this country has ignored that for a long time. Now, we Africans came and we just had the same treatment that has been with Aborigines. We are proud to stand with Aborigines. We are, in that sense, we are all together. And we are here, the issue that matters to us all is one thing, because of our color of skin. We are treated based on our color of skin. So that brings us all united and stand for together that we need leadership of a color that give voice to the whole blackness in Australia. Be it in media, be it in parliament, be it in institutions, the corporate world also has got big question to answer because They're not opening their doors. They talk about diversity, but their diversity is white women.
Right. So we don't have too much time left, and I want to get through a couple of more questions. This next question is a very practical question, which I love, directed toward Professor Langton. And it asks, how do we either revive the Royal Commission into Aboriginal deaths in custody and its recommendations, or do we need some sort of new inquiry of some sort? And if so, what does that look like?
You know, we've had a lot of Royal Commissions lately, and we have the Disability Royal Commission continuing at the moment. The problem with inquiries and Royal Commissions is that governments can simply ignore the recommendations. So you might have noticed that by and large, the Northern Territory government has completely ignored the Royal Commission into the circumstances at the Dondale Youth Detention Centre. They claim that they are implementing them, and then when you dig a bit deeper, you know, the evidence is pretty shaky. All of the jurisdictions are going to continue with, as far as I can tell, from what I can find out. I mean, this is the problem. In the implementation of the recommendations, nobody is transparent, but apparently, from what I can tell, all the jurisdictions are going to continue with spit hoods, putting spit hoods on children. Where's the evidence that they're going to stop the violent treatment of children in detention? So you see, that's the problem. We need to have commissioners, like, you know, in some jurisdictions have children's commissioners, and they defend the rights of children. And you know, they have powers to, you know, investigate problems and so on. And in Victoria, fortunately, we have an Aboriginal Children's Commissioner, Justin Mohammed. And those kinds of posts are what we need. So the Human Rights Commission has been defanged, if you like. You know, they've had their teeth removed over many years. We need these posts in the state jurisdictions with powers to intervene. So I think we need an Aboriginal, well, in any case, you know, something like an Aboriginal Justice Commissioner, whose job it is in each jurisdiction, and in, you know, in some parts of Australia, you need a Torres Strait Islander Justice Commissioner, or somebody to represent both populations, who has the power to properly investigate issues and put up proposals for reform, and inject the information into the state and territory bureaucracies. So the Children's Commissioners have had some effect. You have, you know, state and territory human rights commissioners under state and territory law, like, you know, equal opportunity commissioners. We need the best way to get human rights compliance is to have the remedy as close to the problem as possible. So we need that, you know, the state and territory commissioner roles that I'm talking about, but we also need community organisations empowered to act. So, you know, I'd want to see organisations like, you know, the African Australian associations in Melbourne empowered to be custody notification officers. So as soon as somebody goes into custody, somebody from one of those organisations goes to the watch house or the remand centre. Now, and have powers to stay with the detainee, to represent the detainee at all times, and to ensure that the detainee comes out of detention alive. And I want to see that for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. I want the custody notification scheme implemented in every jurisdiction. And I could go on and on with these recommendations. They're all set out in the Royal Commission into Aboriginal deaths in custody. But you need highly localised solutions, as well as the state and territory solutions. And, you know, I'll just go back to it again, that the gall of the Council of Australian Governments, the National Cabinet, to announce that they're not going to raise the age of criminal responsibility from 10 years to 14 years, that they're blatantly going to breach human rights in Australia. Outrageous. And so we need to keep raising these matters with Australian governments, get them dealt with by COAG, get them dealt with by the state and territory governments, and also at the highly local level.
What we might do, perhaps as a follow-up to this panel, is kind of coalesce some of these resources and make them available to people who've tuned in and in the recording. We'll have time, I think, for 2 more questions. I'm going to say them both before we wrap up. One, I think I will direct to AD. It's from a VCE student, and they're asking, I'm going to be entering Australian society with a new identity as an adult, a brown man, and as a Muslim. He said that he's been lucky to have not experienced a lot of racism in Australia, but fears that they might start to receive it when they become more adults and out of the schooling, the primary schooling ages, and out of high school. So what advice could you give for young adults kind of entering society with that? And then the last question I might throw to Bridget, which is that there's been some social media videos surfacing recently today of white protesters in the United States who are Black Lives Matter protesters, encircling, another group of white diners. I think it was in Washington, D.C., kind of demanding that they show their solidarity and raise their fists and chant Black Lives Matter. How do you see this? What's your reaction to this? It's almost like this aggressive pushing to take sides. And how do you see that impacting the Black Lives Matter movement? Whether that's a productive means of protest, whether other more forms of protests and approaches can be more productive. So AD, perhaps we can start with you answering to that question to the young Muslim Bengali Australian.
Yeah, I think most people answer this, and thank you for the question, by the way, answer this by giving young people tools to navigate racism, to get around it, and to navigate discrimination. I think my advice is, and always has been, to tackle the psychology. So know your self-worth. Know that you don't have to prove yourself in this country, that you do belong here. Okay, but also be very aware that, yes, not everyone is perfect. I'm really surprised, actually, that you didn't get any torment in school. That's really great. But yeah, the world is different, unfortunately. But all I can say is keep your head up, know your self-worth, know that you do belong here, no matter who tells you what, no matter who makes you uncomfortable in the way you dress, in the way you speak, in the way you act. And don't be afraid to call people out. If someone says something wrong, just simply say, what did you mean by that? Or, that's really offensive. Because oftentimes a lot of people get away with these things, these microaggressions, because no one ever pulls them up on it. And a lot of people don't even realize they're doing things, and we get upset. So I think have those conversations. Don't be afraid to have those conversations when you do get out into the real world. And just know that you do belong here and that you're worthy, and Australia belongs to everybody. That's literally my message to every young person going out in the world who feels a little iffy about how Australia views them as a person of color.
That's a great message. Thank you.
I haven't seen the video that the question was referring to, so I can't comment so much on it because I haven't seen it, but I'll look it up afterwards. Look, I think it's interesting when we hear about people being concerned about division or stoking division, or the movement's going this way, or it's getting too aggressive. I think keep your focus. If your focus is anti-racism, anti-blackness, equality in Australia and elsewhere, keep your focus on institutional change. Don't get distracted by videos on YouTube or by people who, there'll always be people who seek to co-opt a movement for their own purposes. But please be looking at your own life, at your own workplace, at your own community, your own state, looking at what we could do to better improve things for people in this country, for First Nations people, whether it's African Australians, for Black Australians. I think to take an eye off the big things that people are saying is not very helpful.
Well, that's also a great message to leave us off with. I mean, I can't begin to thank you enough, all of you, all of our panelists, for this discussion. I personally have learned so much. Your perspectives have been truly fantastic and so informative. You've kicked off, and I think the best way, what will be a very long and protracted discussion that we plan to have on these issues at the Alfred Deakin Institute and through these policy forums. So I can't thank you enough. Thank you for your time. Thank you for your perspectives. Thank you to all of the audience who jumped up to 250 people talking with us and sharing their perspectives and listening to these things. And hopefully this is how change will begin. So thank you again. Good night to everybody. And we will hopefully see you all next time. Apologies if we didn't get to your question. But like I said, this is only one. This is the first of a series of these policy forums. So come back and ask those questions again. Thank you, everyone, and good night.
Thank you. Thank you, Lydia. Thank you, everyone. Marcia will communicate. Bridget, well done. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ben.
Thanks,
Yeah, we'll be in touch. We'll communicate, but we need to stand together because this is not about one or the other. This is about our color of skin.
Yeah.
They're not treating anyone but the color of skin. If we turn white, tomorrow they are different to us.
Yeah.
So the question is, we need to unite to maximize the effort for our future generation.
The problem is not us, the problem is racism.
It is indeed. It is indeed. So let's work together to make a better future for our children.
Yes, let's team up. Good idea.
Right.
You know where I am?
It was lovely meeting everyone. Marcia, I was so excited to get to panel with you today. So that was really awesome. Bridget, it was lovely to meet you.
Yeah, it was great to meet you.
Yeah. Dr. Barhan is like my second father. So
thanks, Barhan. Thanks, Marcia.
Thank you, Bridget.
Thank you. On the same panel
we'll be in touch. I'm at Melbourne University as well. My connection is there, Marcia. We'll be in touch.
Okay. Email me.
Okay.
Good night, everyone.
Thank you, Lydia.
bye.
Thank you.
Lydia.
Thank you.
Bye.
Good night.